All right. So if you're watching today, this is the second session in our menstruation celebration series. Um, we have Kourtney Rider with us from the Hamilton Health Center. My name's Miss Samantha. You can reach me at the Madeline Allwine Memorial Library. And yeah, thank you for watching. Thank you, Kourtney, for being here. I'll turn it over to you and let you get started.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here for you folks again. This is our second part of the menstrual hygiene education series. Menstrual Hygiene Day is on May 28th. It's an annual day that we recognize and celebrate what the body is capable of doing. So today's lesson is specifically on the cycle and the cycle basics. So we're actually going to go over the 4 phases, and it's basically giving you the science behind the menstrual cycle. This education session is for all teenagers. So if you're not someone who cycles or has a bleed of any sort, don't be afraid to learn a little bit more about how this works, regardless of what body you have. So before we begin, just like last time, I just want to let you know it's okay to be uncomfortable with this conversation. No question is dumb or silly. So if you have any questions, please feel free to get in contact with us. And everyone has their own experience. Everyone has their own body, their own feelings towards their body, and these are not up for debate. Your experience is your own, and it is completely valid, whatever you are going through. So let's dive right in. I don't expect you to remember all of this information today from this one session, right? This is something I've studied for many years, something that I teach, so I have a really good grasp on it, right? So I don't expect you to remember everything we talk about today, but we are going to talk about the 4 phases, and they're pictured here in this wheel, this circle. So last week we talked about actual menstruation and the products that can be used to manage your period or your bleeds. This time we're actually going to take a look at menstruation, as well as everything that's happening in the body when you're not actively bleeding. It's called a cycle because we're doing things in the background that when we're not bleeding that we might not even know is happening. So our body is made up of a lot of different systems, right? We have our digestive system, which is how we eat and process food out. We have our respiratory system, which helps us breathe. Probably hearing a lot about that right now with COVID, because that disease impacts the respiratory system. We have our endocrine system, which is a bunch of different parts that help us make hormones. We have our immune system, which helps us fight off sickness like the flu. We have our skeletal system, nervous system, circulatory system, lots of different systems, right? And all of these pieces come together to make up our entire body. So our cycle is mainly our reproductive system. It's the parts of our body that allow us to reproduce or make offspring, have children. So we're going to be talking mostly about the reproductive system today and the different phases that are also impacted by hormones. So there is a little bit of the endocrine system we'll be learning about today as well. The first phase is always your menstrual phase. That's what we talked about last week. Then your second phase after you're done bleeding is called your follicular phase. Then you move into your ovulatory phase. And last but not least, we enjoy the luteal phase. And then we start bleeding and start it all over again. And we just keep going, which is why most people bleed every month. Ideally, your cycles will be between 24 and 36 days. So from the time you start bleeding until you come around all the way through this circle until you start bleeding again, we would ideally like that to be 24 to 36 days apart. So puberty starts in the brain. We need to know that our brain talks to all of our body parts. It's how everything's connected. So our brain talks to our reproductive organs, regardless of which ones you have. Our reproductive organs then help us to make hormones. They help us process all of the different happenings and get hormonal messengers where they need to be. Hormones impact our entire body. We talked about all the different systems. They all work together. This is another aspect that we need to keep healthy so that every other system can work at its best. Puberty, of course, is going to impact a lot of different things because it impacts the whole body. So our body hair will change, our chest might change, our voices might change. We might see some acne or some changes in our skin. Our sweat might change, whether that's how much we sweat, what it smells like, where it's coming from. That might be new to us. This will also impact the way we feel, our mood, our emotions, our thoughts. Anything that's happening hormonally can certainly impact us as young people when we're going through puberty. And puberty takes time. It takes a few years for these pathways to establish, for your hormones to figure out their roles and figure out where they belong. So it can take a few years to feel at our best. If you are on any type of hormonal medication, such as birth control, or you're in the transgender community and you're transitioning, you might be someone who is having your hormones altered by medication. So no matter what body you're in, puberty impacts us all in very different ways. It's a very challenging time, so you're not alone, and you do deserve to feel really well. So if you need support, please don't be afraid to reach out to us, and we can help guide you in the right way for medical care or mental and emotional support if that's something you need. So we are going to have to talk about some body parts. That's coming next. Just brace yourself. We did talk about these parts last week, but we're going to have to do a refresher. So the reason that we have a cycle is for people who have ovaries. So ovaries are internal, they are inside of the body, inside of the abdomen or the tummy area, and they are what are responsible for creating eggs, and that is what is responsible for the entire cycle that we're talking about today, all 4 of those steps. So as long as everyone's doing okay, take a deep breath and we'll get right into it. Starting with menstruation, again, this is always phase 1. This is always where everything first starts. So this is the time that you're actively bleeding. You usually bleed for 3 to 7 days. And whenever you start bleeding, that's going to be considered cycle day 1. So if you're counting, remember how we said we like them to ideally for health to be between 24 and 36 days. When you start bleeding, that's going to be day number 1, and you can start counting to see how long it takes until you get your next bleed. You actually bleed because your hormones are at their lowest. They're all taking a break, giving your body a rest, and you're able to bleed. Some people experience things we call PMS or premenstrual syndrome. These we went over last week, things like cramping, headaches, fatigue, having some digestive distress. Some people get constipated, meaning they can't poop. Some people get diarrhea, which means they're pooping all the time. Some people start to feel really emotionally overwhelmed, really sensitive, might cry a little more, might be angrier a little more. So these are all common experience. I want to remind you again, like I did last week, suffering is not normal. So if you're in a lot of pain, or if you're having a lot of digestive issues, or if you're feeling really emotional, please seek support for that. You don't have to suffer through this experience, I promise. You're supposed to feel well, be able to go to school, be able to eventually go to work, and feel good while you're menstruating. And again, it takes 4 to 6 years for these hormonal pathways to mature. So from the time you start menstruating as a young person up until 4 to 6 years after, it might take time for things to balance themselves out and for you to start feeling at your best. So that's our first phase. After we've stopped bleeding, what happens next? What's happening in my body? Well, it's called the follicular phase. You can also call this the pre-ovulatory phase. So it's what's happening before you ovulate, pre-ovulatory. So this begins again in the brain. The brain talks to that ovary, that organ I showed you, and that's where your eggs are. And this phase allows those eggs to be matured. You mature a lot all at once, maybe a dozen or so. And this phase can take as long as it needs, as long as the brain is talking to the ovary and trying to get some eggs matured. This process can take days, it can take months for some people. And especially as you're figuring things out and your body is establishing this way, it might take a little bit of time, and it might change. You might have one cycle that's really, really long and one cycle that's really, really short. It all depends on this phase, how long those eggs take to mature. So of course, this can change throughout your life. As a young person, it might be a little all over the place. As an older person, it might be pretty stable, pretty normal for you. And stress and illness can certainly change this. So if you are changing medications for any reason, if you're going through something really stressful, maybe the loss of a loved one, or you just changed schools, or you're getting a new job, or you've traveled recently, these can all impact this phase and how long it takes for your brain and ovary to get an egg ready. Your period is never late and is never early. It's actually your ovulation, which is the phase we will move into next. As I mentioned, your cycle will change in length. So at the top of this image, we have someone who's having a 25-day cycle. In the middle, we have a 28-day cycle, and at the bottom, a 35-day cycle. I just used this image to show you visually that that follicular phase I just mentioned that we just went over, that it can change. It can take days, it can take months. That's what impacts the cycle length mostly. So this person, this could all be the same person experiencing a 25-day, a 28-day, and a 35-day, again, all within healthy lengths. But that follicular phase, that time for the brain to create that egg with the ovary, can take difference in times. And that's just what this picture represents. So ovulation is the main event of the cycle, and it basically is just the word for the release of a ripe egg. So bled, we spent about a week or two getting another egg ready. Once that egg is big enough, healthy enough, the body releases it out of the ovary and puts it into the fallopian. This is just called ovulation, the release of that egg. So it happens in one moment in time, in one day. It's not necessarily like a week or 2 week long process of ovulation. It's mostly just bleeding, getting that egg ready, and then when that egg is ready, ovulation is a single moment, and it's the main event, and it determines where our period is then going to come. Our bodies give us signs of ovulation. Our body will physically change in a few ways. So whenever we're getting ready to ovulate, we might see more fluid in our underwear. We might call this discharge. More accurately, it would be called cervical fluid. This makes fluid in the body, in the vagina, and it might come out and you might see it closer to ovulation. Your body temperature will also change once you ovulate. Your body temperature, if you were someone who takes it every day, you might see that it goes up and stays up after ovulation. There's a whole scientific method to this. It's called the symptothermal method of birth control. And that's just the science of how we know what ovulation does to the body. And some people prefer to use that to chart or track their cycles so that they know what's going on every day. Some people might also experience other symptoms around ovulation. Some people will have a really good mood, really high energy. They feel really social. They're really confident. They want to get out there and have fun, have a good time, maybe try something new with their friends. This is typically some things you might feel. Some people also might feel ovulation cramping, maybe a little pain in the lower tummy where your ovaries are as that egg is being spit out, which is what this picture here represents. We have our ovary, which is the big pink ball, and then we have our egg or our follicle, which is the yellow circle. And ovulation is just the exit from that egg out of the ovary and into that tube. That's what ovulation is. That egg then hangs out in that tube and lives for about 12 to 24 hours. It's only about one day that that egg is available. And if it were to be met with a sperm, that is how offspring is made. But again, we're only talking about the cycle today. So this egg is only available for 24 hours. And then we move into something called our luteal phase. Again, I don't expect you to remember all of this right away today. It's a lot of information, but I just like to let you know that there's something going on constantly in the body rather than just our period or our bleed. So the luteal phase is the very last of the 4 phases. It is called the post-ovulatory phase, so after ovulation. This phase is magical, in my opinion, because it doesn't change in length. So we bleed for a few days, 3 to 7. The follicular phase can vary, take as long as it wants. Then we ovulate a single moment in time, and then the luteal phase doesn't change. It's always between 9 and 18 days, and every person will have somewhat of a magic number. Most people fall between the 12 and 14-day range, and that's how we know when to expect our next bleed. Some people will begin to experience some of those PMS symptoms we talked about in the beginning, the cramping, the fatigue, the mood change. That might start happening in this phase as your body's preparing for your next bleed. When you see your next bleed, this phase is over and we can start counting cycle day 1 all over again with menstruation. So I just want to show you again that picture of the fact that the follicular phase is what changes that egg maturing. But once we've ovulated, we always will get our bleed within 9 to 18 days. This person in this image, their magic number is 14 days. It stays very stable, not a lot of change happening in that phase, and then they go on to have their menstruation again. So to sum up, there's 4 phases of your menstrual cycle. The first phase is your active flow, your time of bleeding. Then you move into your follicular phase where your brain tells the ovary to mature some eggs. Then in ovulation, that mature egg is released and is living for up to 24 hours inside the body. And after that, we just wait for the next cycle to begin, which always happens between 9 and 18 days. And this is how we can chart our cycles and learn more about our body and our individual patterns. I always like to give you folks some resources on books if you want to learn more about the cycle on your own, learn more about your body and how it feels. So there are a few books here. Period by 12 Voices is a book written by 12 different folks, also has folks who are transgender and have experienced menstruation. So if that's the community you fall within, please feel free to check out that book. There's another book called I've Got My Period, So What by Carla Henry. There's a book called This Period in My Life by Saskia Bugeaud. There's also Cycle Savvy by Toni Weskler. I have another book of hers, which is really fantastic about the science of the cycle called Taking Charge of Your Fertility. That book is probably a little bit older and a little more scientific based, but Cycle Savvy is a great starter book. And then The Fifth Vital Sign by Lisa Hendrickson-Jack talks all about how the color of our bleed can mean things, the way we feel can mean things, and how we can help fix that and make ourselves feel as best as possible while we're going through our cycle. You will cycle from the time that you are a young teenager, anywhere between 8 and 16 years old when you get your first bleed, all the way up until you're an adult, and in your 50s is usually when it stops. So don't be afraid to grab a book, learn something. You can follow most of these authors on social media as well. And I just want to encourage you to please always choose what is best for you, period.
Thank you so much, Kourtney. That was so informative. I learned so much. And like, you answered questions I've had for like such a long time. So
very good.
Thank you so much for that great presentation. I will add your contact information to the end of this video.
Thank you.
Please, anyone out there who's watching this, feel free to reach out if you need help or someone you love or anything like that. Kourtney's here to answer your questions.
Absolutely. Always here for you folks at the Hamilton Health Center in Harrisburg if you need anything.